So first of all, thank you all for joining today. For people who don't know me, my name is Grace, and I've been with NonCash Recruitment for 4 years now, and I look after quality assurance and regulatory affairs positions. So as most of you may know, we've been running yearly salary surveys for the last 15 years to provide to our clients and candidates a good insight into the life sciences employment landscape in Australia. So this year we've decided to share the result by running a series of webinars focusing on different functional sectors. So today I will focus on sharing the data with regards to regulatory affairs. So I'll be covering the following topics. So first I'll talk through the context of the survey, so a bit of background of how and when the survey was run. Then we will look at the cash and non-cash benefits. Then we will move on to the employee experience, so looking at some job satisfaction data. And then we will dive into, I guess, what the challenges of managers have been with regards to attracting, managing, and retaining talents. But before we get started, just some housekeeping. So you will all receive a recording of this session along with the salary and job satisfaction report. And if you do have any questions, please use the bubble chat function at the top right corner of your screen. I'll try to answer questions as I go, but if not, I will actually answer them at the end of the webinar. And so the webinar should last around 25 to 30 minutes, but we've booked an hour to allocate time for questions. Right, so let's get started with the context of the survey. So this year we had just over 1,000 contributors who were mostly in permanent full-time positions. We were lucky enough to have, I guess, contributors coming from a different company size, which is quite good to have a good reflection on what the life sciences industry looks like. In the survey, we've asked our traditional set of questions with regards to job satisfaction, but also some questions around COVID-19 and how it's impacted their work in the workplace. Another important aspect with regards to the context of the survey is when it was conducted. So it was conducted in June, July this year. So partway through it, Sydney had gone into lockdown. So it's quite important to bear that in mind when looking at the results. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on regulatory affairs. So let's look at how many regulatory affairs contributors we had. So we had 239 regulatory affairs contributors. Thank you all for contributing. They were split across the following job titles. So you had Regulatory Affairs Manager, Senior Reg Affairs Associate, Reg Affairs Associate, Head of RA. And we also included hybrid job titles with RA QA, which tend to be most commonly found in the medical device industry, where you have QA and RA sitting as part of the same team. I guess another component to take into consideration when looking at the regulatory affairs data, it's the industry in which the contributors worked. So 37% of the RA contributors worked for an innovator company, 18% were from the medical device industry, 16% with the generics companies, and then you had 7% of the contributors who were from OTC or complementary medicine. So I guess now that we set up the context, let's move on to the first part, which is the cash and non-cash benefits. So we'll start to look at salary increases over the last 12 months. So this year, the percentage of respondents who were eligible for a pay increase is aligned with last year's percentage. So we've got 64% this year against 65% last year. And we define someone to be eligible for a pay increase if they've been with the same employer for at least 12 months. When we look at the RA cohort, it's actually a bit higher. 70% of the eligible RA contributor did receive a pay increase in the last 12 months. A good thing as well to note for the life science industry is that 62% of the contributors who did receive a pay increase received a pay increase of above 2%. I guess the usual CPI 2%, which is quite good, and I guess showing that the life science industry is recovering well. But still, we're not there yet, given that before COVID, the percentage of respondents who would receive a pay increase was 77%. And I guess another key or interesting factor on that slide is the fact that only 53% of the respondents who changed job received a pay increase. And I guess the common assumption is that people would only change job if they were to actually receive a pay increase. And when it comes to the reason why people haven't been receiving the increase, obviously the headcount freeze related to the COVID-19 pandemic has been the top reason. So now we will look at the salary table for regulatory affairs. I'm not going to go into much detail because you're going to be receiving a copy of the report, but I do want to highlight that these numbers are inclusive of the base salary, the superannuation, and the car allowance when applicable, and it excludes bonuses and commission. And on the next slide, you will have, I guess, the same job title, but separated by industries. So you've got your pharmaceutical, medical device, government, and so on. Historically, innovator companies have always been the highest payers. Then you've got the medical devices and the generics companies who are more or less on par. And then you've got your OTC and consumer health businesses. It's important to note that OTC businesses that are actually attached to, let's say, an originator company tend to be highest payer compared to a standalone complementary medicine or OTC business. And finally, I'm not sure whether you know, but we actually do a lot of recruitment for the TGA and the old NICNAS, Office of Chemical Safety. You will note that the salary are definitely not as competitive as the one you find in industry, but people tend to go there to, I guess, make a difference on a bigger scale. So on the next slide, you have, I guess, the most senior job titles. So now that we looked at the cash component of the survey, let's look at the non-cash benefits. So looking at non-cash benefits, flexible working hours and working from home are top of the list. Since COVID, these non-cash benefits have significantly increased, and they've been quite common and standard in the industry. And nowadays, when we're having conversation with candidates, no matter, I guess, the functional sector, the first question I ask is, what's the flexibility to work from home? So just one thing to note, though, is that professional development and further studies appears in the top 5 most valued benefits. And this has been quite consistent over the last few years. So if your company offers this, then it's certainly worth promoting during the interviewing process. And if your company is not offering that, then maybe looking at a way to introduce that as part of the, let's say, employer value proposition to your candidates to be a bit more competitive on the market. So now we'll move on to the employee experience, so looking at some job satisfaction data. So overall, in the life sciences industry, people tend to be quite satisfied. And that would be the same as well for the RA cohort. So 67% of the RA contributors declared being satisfied or very satisfied by their job. People like what they do. They're very engaged, and I guess it tends to be the same for men and women. This is a fantastic point from a retention perspective, but it's even more challenges for companies looking to recruit more staff. So if we look at the reason why people have left their employers, and this applies to all sectors, and on the next slides, I will actually look a bit more into regulatory affairs, which differs quite a lot from, I guess, that slide. So the reasons for leaving were obviously wanting to get more money, lack of job satisfaction, and excessive workload. And actually excessive workload is the first time it appears as one of the top reasons. Last year, it was a lack of opportunities for career progression. And I guess it definitely demonstrates that COVID had an impact on managers, but also people in the teams with regards to not being able to hire more staff to deal with the different priorities in the business. And I guess when it comes to the reason why people are staying with their current employer, salary is not one of them. The flexibility in the workplace, again, comes back. The supportive management relationship is actually really important. And I think it's really applies to the regulatory affairs cohort. And then the opportunity for career advancement and promotion is another reason why people are staying with their current employer. So let's look at the reason for leaving for regulatory affairs professionals. So you will notice that it's actually quite varied. And only 12% of the contributors have selected higher salary as a driver to actually change job. 14% have actually declared that any issues related with management would be a reason for them leaving. So that includes unsupportive management, conflict with their direct managers, or unhappy with the company culture. And again, the excessive workload is back this year with 16% not being happy with either their position or the workload. So I guess what we can take away from that is that it's really important to bear in mind. I know we have a lot of managers attending the session, that building that relationship with your team and making sure that they're blossoming not only in their role but in their interaction is going to be quite critical to retain them within the organization. We've also looked at well-being at work. So basically, 82% of the people who contributed to the survey mentioned that they were feeling really stressed at work. And again, it's linked to this excessive workload and not being able to recruit people to actually assist with the workload. But the good thing is, when we look at the regulatory affairs cohort, most people were quite comfortable to reach out to their manager to actually address any workload related stress or mental health well-being or not being very safe at work with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess that's a good sign. So now we'll move on to, I guess, the last part of the webinar, which is around hiring talent, but also looking at attracting and retaining them. So to give you a bit more context, out of the 239 contributors, we had 108 managers, and 55% of them reported that it had become more difficult over the last 12 months to recruit talent. And 59% reported that it was more difficult for them to actually ensure the health and well-being, the mental health and well-being of their staff. So in that climate, I guess it's always a bit, I guess in regulatory affairs, it's always been very difficult to attract talent, but it's going to be the war for talent is going to be very, very, very high at the moment. So when we look at the plans of our manager to actually recruit in the next 12 months in that climate, actually 29 or 55% actually have reported that they would actually increase their permanent or contractor headcount. So how will they be able to do that when people in the regulatory affairs sectors tend to be quite content with their role? Earlier, I've mentioned that 70% of the RA contributors had mentioned that they were happy in their current positions. So if we look overall in the industry, it takes around 6 to 10 weeks to actually fill a vacancy. And we will see that it's more or less the same in the regulatory affairs sectors. Most of the time, given how competitive the market is now, there's a lot of job out there and candidates are getting multiple offers. And the reasons for candidates decline employers' offer have been around getting either an offer from another company or actually getting a counter offer from their current company. But it would be interesting to know whether these candidates who have been offered a counter offer from their current employer would actually stay long term, because it's often found that a counter offer may work for 6 months, but then 12 months later, the person would leave anyway because their job satisfaction is still, I guess, not there. So let's look at regulatory affairs. So you will note that 72% of the RA manager have declared that it takes them at least 6 to 10 weeks to recruit someone in the position, with 19% saying, you know, they're still recruiting. And their jobs offered have been declined, I guess, at multiple occasions. So here the job offer declined in the past 12 months. It's looking at the RA contributors who have declined job offers, and you will note that 70% have at least declined 2 job offers. So that's how competitive the market is at the moment. So the next slide is talking about people looking or considering to actually change jobs in the next 12 months. You will note that in the industry, 38% were considering or applied for a new job in the last 12 months, which is, I guess, quite low considering that a lot of companies are currently hiring. In regulatory affairs, actually, it's even lower than 38%. We're looking at 31%. And again, you know, you've got those multiple job offers, and people, when they actually applied for a position, they're quite successful at getting that new opportunity. So I guess when we look at the regulatory affairs market and how to attract the right staff, the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted the landscape of the competition. Nowadays, we're looking more at having candidates, or to recruit candidates into state, which was not an option before COVID. So we looked at what manager and how manager felt about hiring remote workers, and actually 29% of managers in the industry as a whole are now considering employing people who would be based 100% of the time interstate. And actually, in the regulatory affairs sector, it's not 29%, but 48%. So you're no longer only competing with, let's say, if you're based in Sydney, pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies based in Sydney, you would also be competing with companies based, let's say, in Brisbane, Melbourne, or even Perth or Adelaide, who are keen to get the right talent and the right fit for the team, and would be willing to have someone who's based remotely 100% of the time. So I thought it'd be quite helpful to also share the top reason why regulatory affairs people have stayed with their current employer. And the top reasons are obviously the flexibility in the workplace. And again, when we have those conversations with candidates, that's one of the first questions they ask, but because people, obviously, they've got personal commitment. And I guess job satisfaction is also one, and we find in regulatory affairs, people tend to leave when the pipeline of product is not as strong, or they're looking, for example, to move from a generic company to an innovator company. And I guess the supportive management and the opportunity for career advancement is quite important. So I'd say when looking at recruiting people in the regulatory affairs space, the right cultural fit is quite important, not only at a team associate, senior associate level, but also at the managerial level. We find in the industry that when a regulatory affairs manager moves to another company, the teams tend to follow, simply because there's, I guess, the trust component there that is quite important. And regulatory affairs professionals tend to be quite risk adverse in general. And I guess as we move into the next phase of the global pandemic and offices reopen, it comes as no surprise that the life sciences companies have reconfigured the way they work. They've offered flexibility of working from home. There's a bit more focus on mental health and well-being. And obviously, they want to make sure that they're able to provide, I guess, a work-life balance to the employees. But I guess the challenge is even going to be harder for people who are looking to go back to a world where before COVID, where people are based 100% of the time in the office, to actually attract the right people, given that at the moment everyone is getting that flexibility. I guess we're coming towards the end of the presentation there, and I hope that it gave you a bit of insight on what's happening, on what happened last year on the market, and how COVID has impacted the employment landscape in Australia with regards to the life sciences industry. And thank you again for people who have contributed to the survey. And if you've never contributed to a survey or used to, please make sure to contribute to our 2022 survey so that the data is quite strong and we can actually provide a very good insight. So I guess just reminding you that you'll be receiving a recording of the webinar along with the copy of the salary and job satisfaction report. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Feel free to reach out to me directly. But I'd be happy to answer any questions if any of you have some now. I can't see the chat, but we'll see whether we had any questions. I'll try to stop sharing my screen. Sorry about that.
Hi, Grace. I think we have one question.
Sure, I can't see them. Sorry.
Who has asked, do you consider the regulatory operations titles?
I know some companies do have regulatory operations titles, but it's not the norm. So we've decided, so I guess people who would have actually had a regulatory operation title would have either been into regulatory affairs project manager or senior regulatory affairs associate. The regulatory affairs operation title is not a job title that we come across quite often in the industry. Do we have any other questions, Atufa?
Oh, I think that's it for now.
Sure. Okay. So I guess once you receive the salary and job satisfaction report and you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me. And thank you so much for your time.